What's up everyone, I'm Mike with woodshopmike.com and today I'm going to show you how to make some shaker style doors. At this point I've already run my boards through the joiner and planer so they're to final thickness, and I'm cutting the stiles and rails to width on the table saw. For these doors I'm using tongue and groove joinery and making those cuts on the router table. That said, I've made plenty of shaker style doors on the table saw, so if you don't have a router table, no worries. With the cutter set up, I bring the fence forward and use a straight edge to make sure the bearing is tangent with the router fence. I always test my setups on an extra piece of stock that's the same size as my finished pieces. I found that using a featherboard to hold the pieces against the fence and table produced much better results. With everything set where I think it should be, I cut a groove and check the fit against a piece my center panels will be made from. I made a few additional test cuts to tweak the height of the groove to be dead center, and once everything is set, I now cut the groove in all of my stiles and rails. With the grooves cut, I now cut all the rails and stiles to final length. I use a piece of Luan against the fence as a backer board to keep the back side of the cut from blowing out. I also set up a stop block to make batching out these cuts faster and more accurate. Back at the router table, I switch the bits out to cut the tongues on the end of each rail. I also adjust the space between the cutters by changing up the stack of washers to match the width of the groove that I just cut. Next, I set the height of the cutter so that I cut the tongues centered on the groove. Again, using a straight edge, I bring the fence forward until the fence and bearing are tangent. I grab a piece of scrap left over from ripping the rails and stiles to width, and I make a test cut. This piece looks pretty good, but the fit is just a little bit too loose. So at this point I'll go back and add another shim to spread the cutters apart a touch more, and then make another test cut. I repeat this process until the tongue is in the proper location and to the right thickness. A few test cuts later, and I'm ready to cut the end of my rails. I clamped a piece of Luan to the miter gauge to keep my rails from splintering as the cutter passed through the backside of the material. Also, you may have noticed I'm turning the piece rather than flipping it end over end. I'm doing this so that the surface of the rails that was against the table when cutting the first end stays against the table when cutting the second end. So at this point, all of the rails have had the tongues cut on them, but there's always just a little bit of cleanup to do. So, this is like paper thin right here. Really, you can just fold that over with your finger, but I just use a sharp chisel or a utility knife and a little bit of sandpaper to make sure that this is all nice and tidy before we start assembling the doors. The important thing here is to make sure your chisel is very sharp and to cut toward the piece rather than away from it. By doing this, you'll reduce any tear out that might have already started when cutting the tongues. For the center panels, I'm using 1/4 inch plywood. These are going to be painted, so I could have used MDF, but I had this on hand, and honestly, I prefer to work with plywood rather than MDF anyways. Also, yes, I'm cross-cutting on the table saw. I know this makes some folks nervous, but what I do is keep even pressure against the fence and make sure to not twist the board during the cut. But the general rule when working with machinery of any kind is if you're not comfortable with the operation, use another tool to get the job done. With all of my parts cut, it's time to do a dry run on the assembly. I want to make sure there aren't any parts that need modification before I start gluing things together. The last thing I do before gluing the doors up is to give all the parts a quick sand. These will end up being painted so I don't have to go crazy, but giving everything a once over will really improve the finish of the doors. I get a ton of questions about what sander I use in the shop, so if you guys are interested, it's the 5-inch electric ray by Surf Prep, and I have a 10% off discount code in the description below if you're wanting to grab one of these and add it to your shop. When gluing up the doors, I put glue on the end of each rail. With the first two pieces together, I go ahead and slide the panel into place and then continue gluing the remaining pieces together. At this point in the assembly process, I'm intentionally leaving the rails a bit proud of the stiles. With the door and a pair of clamps, I apply moderate pressure across the stiles, and with an additional clamp, I slowly apply pressure to bring the rails flush with the top and bottom of each stile. These are usually a bit stubborn and then will all of a sudden pop into place. Usually this does the trick, and the rails end up right where they need to be, but on occasion, when the rail pops into place, it goes a bit too far. So here's how I fix things when that happens. Using a scrap block of wood, I set it against the rail and hit it with a dead blow hammer until it moves where it needs to be. And of course, here I went just a touch too hard, so I'll grab a clamp to bring the rail back flush with the stiles. Now with the rail in place, I fully clamp down across the stiles and then remove the clamp that's across the rails. One last thing to do is to measure across the corners to make sure that the panel is square. And if everything checks out here, you can set the door aside until the glue cures. Okay, so that is how you build a shaker style door. There are a couple things left to do, like drilling for your hardware and also finishing the door. Coming up in the end card, I have a video on how to build a base cabinet along with our laundry room renovation. In that video, I show you how to consistently drill for your door hardware.
Ah, you're still there. Awesome. Hey, if you enjoyed this video, I got another one queued up for you right here. And if you want other awesome content from me, check out those. Anyways, hope you enjoyed the video. Please hit the like and subscribe. And until next time, have fun making something.